captive of the Alpha King. The night carried a biting chill, the damp air of the dungeon pressing against Storm like a suffocating shroud. Shadows clung to the stone walls, and the cold crept into her bones, an unrelenting reminder of her imprisonment. Each breath felt heavy, laced with the scent of decay and damp earth, making her stomach twist. She clenched her fists, trying to ignore the way the icy moisture seeped into her skin, draining what little warmth she had left. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water, a cruel metronome counting down the moments she had left in this wretched place. A chilling draft slithered through the cracks in the stone walls, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. The dampness clung to her skin, seeping into her very bones, while the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the cavernous darkness. The scent of decay and unwashed bodies made her stomach churn, a grim reminder of where she was. Every breath she took felt heavy, laced with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid bite of mold. Her muscles ached from exhaustion, her body stiff from the unforgiving stone beneath her. She curled her fingers, dirt crusted under her nails, and clenched her jaw, forcing herself to steady her breathing despite the overwhelming sense of entrapment. The stench of decay and blood lingered, thick and unrelenting, seeping into her very bones. She had spent years rebuilding her life, navigating the harshest edges of the world without a pack, without a family. The loneliness had been suffocating, each day a brutal fight for survival. She had wandered through hostile territories, hiding from predators, both human and supernatural, who would have taken advantage of her solitude. Nights had been the worst, curled up in abandoned shelters, cold and hungry, her body weary, but her mind refusing to rest. Yet she endured, teaching herself to fight, to steal when necessary, to move unseen like a shadow against the moonlight. With every hardship, she had become stronger, a survivor in a world that had long since abandoned her. And still, fate had dragged her back to the one place she never wished to return, the kingdom of Alpha Troy. She remembered the nights spent curled up in hollowed-out tree trunks, shivering against the cold, her stomach aching with hunger. There had been moments when she had stolen food from market stalls only to be chased away like a stray dog. She had fought off rogues who saw a lone wolf as nothing more than prey, her body bearing the scars of battles she had barely survived. Every day had been a battle for survival, a test of her strength and will. And yet, through it all, she had endured, refusing to break, refusing to let the world crush her spirit. The nights had been long and unforgiving, filled with the howls of distant wolves who would never call her one of their own. She had fought for every scrap of food, every moment of shelter, enduring the cruelty of rogues, the indifference of wandering packs, and the relentless danger of hunters who saw lone wolves as nothing more than sport. She had built herself anew, forging a hardened shell to shield the broken pieces of her heart. And yet, fate had a cruel way of dragging her back to the very place she swore to never return, the kingdom of Alpha Troy. Storm's fingers traced the rusted chains wrapped around her wrists, her skin raw and aching from the cold metal digging into her flesh. The rough edges had already torn into her delicate skin, and each slight movement sent jolts of pain radiating up her arms. Her breath hitched as she clenched her fists, fighting against the searing agony. The weight of the chains felt unbearable, a cruel reminder of her captivity. Desperation clawed at her chest, suffocating her as she struggled to remain calm. The walls of the dungeon felt as though they were closing in, and the sheer helplessness of her situation made her stomach twist. She had to escape, before it was too late. Her breath was shallow, her chest tightening with each passing second as she fought against the mounting panic. She needed to escape. The damp, suffocating air of the dungeon made her lightheaded, and the iron scent of blood was thick in her nostrils. Every muscle in her body screamed for action, but exhaustion kept her limbs heavy. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her frayed nerves, knowing that if she didn't find a way out soon, she would never leave this place alive. She had been captured at the border, mistaken for an enemy rogue. If the Alpha King discovered she was here, there would be no mercy. The last time she had seen him, his golden eyes had been cold and merciless. The moment she realized she was his second-chance mate, fear had seized her heart. She had barely made it out of the kingdom alive, chased by his warriors through the dense forest, her body torn by branches and exhaustion. She had run for days, surviving on scraps and hiding in the shadows until she finally crossed the borders, collapsing in an unfamiliar land. She had left everything behind, her home, her family, determined to forge her own path, believing he would never know of their bond. A sudden clamor of boots echoed down the stone hallway. The guards barked orders, dragging another prisoner into the depths of the castle's prison. Storm remained still, her heart pounding as the heavy scent of blood filled the air. She didn't dare lift her head as the iron doors groaned open. "Take him to the chamber," a deep voice commanded, sending a chill down Storm's spine. That voice. It was him. Alpha Troy. She clenched her jaw as the guards hauled the half-conscious man into a separate cell. Troy's presence filled the room with an undeniable power, his scent laced with the scent of war and dominance. Yet, he seemed different. There was something layered beneath his usual icy exterior. His shoulders carried a weight they hadn't before, and there was a tension in his stance, like a man who had fought too many battles, lost too many things. His golden eyes, once sharp with arrogance, now held something else, something Storm couldn't place. Was it exhaustion? Remorse? Or was she simply imagining things in the dim candlelight of the dungeon? Storm kept her head low, willing herself to blend into the shadows, but Troy hesitated. His nostrils flared as he turned in her direction. "What is that smell?" he muttered, stepping closer. Her heart pounded so fiercely she feared it would betray her presence. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to disappear before he could recognize her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to suppress the rising panic clawing at her throat. The overwhelming stench of prisoners and damp rot masked her scent well enough. But what if it wasn't enough? What if his wolf sensed her beneath the filth and decay? Her hands trembled, her nails digging into the rough stone wall behind her, desperate for an escape route. After a brief pause, he turned back to the captive man, his voice turning sharp, and she exhaled, forcing herself to remain utterly still, praying to the moon goddess that this moment wouldn't be the one where fate betrayed her. "You will tell me what I need to know," Troy growled, the sound of a blade unsheathing slicing through the thick air. Storm squeezed her eyes shut as the man's tortured screams filled the chamber. Each agonized cry sent a fresh wave of rage and revulsion through her, but beneath it all was fear, bone-deep, paralyzing fear. Her breath hitched, her chest tightening as the horrific sounds echoed in her ears, each one a reminder of the man she had barely escaped. She could almost feel his rejection all over again, the cold detachment in his golden eyes. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She pressed herself further into the shadows, her hands shaking as she tried to convince herself she was stronger than this, stronger than the fear clawing at her insides. Troy was still the same monster who had cast her aside, and she would rather die than let him claim her now. As the torture dragged on, Storm knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She needed to escape before Troy's wolf fully recognized her scent. She had survived for years on her own, and she wouldn't let the past undo her now. But fate was never that kind. A sudden silence filled the chamber, thick and unnatural. Storm chanced to glance up, only to find Troy standing mere feet away, his golden eyes piercing into her. He knew. Troy's expression was unreadable, but his body tensed as if he had been struck. "Storm?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Her body went rigid, but she forced herself to remain still. The guards stiffened, uncertain of their alpha's sudden shift in demeanor. "Take her to my chambers," he finally ordered, his voice an unreadable command. The guards hesitated. "Sire, she's just—" "I said take her to my chambers." Storm fought against the hands that grabbed her, but exhaustion and starvation had weakened her to the point of helplessness. Her body screamed for her to resist, to break free, but her limbs felt like lead, her strength drained by days of deprivation. Fear gripped her chest like a vice as she realized she was truly powerless against them. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was Troy's conflicted gaze burning into her, an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Was it shock, anger, or something else entirely? But it didn't matter. The abyss claimed her, pulling her under as the world faded away. Storm awoke in a lavish room, her wrists still bruised from the chains, but now free. The scent of cedar and embers clung to the air, unmistakably his. The door creaked open and Troy stepped inside, his golden eyes scanning her face with an unreadable expression. "You have changed," he finally said, his voice softer than she remembered. She scoffed, her body aching as she sat up. "And you haven't." He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You don't understand." "No, I do," she cut him off. "I understand perfectly. You never even knew, did you? You never realized I was your second chance mate. I ran before you could, before you had the chance to throw me away like I was nothing. I left everything behind because I refused to be another casualty of your indifference. And now, after all this time, after everything I suffered, you think you can just claim me?" His jaw tightened, but there was no anger in his gaze. "Things have changed since you left." "I don't care," she spat. "I would rather rot in that cell than let you touch me." Troy flinched but nodded. "If that's what you want." Storm expected anger, force, anything but this unsettling acceptance. She expected the cold-hearted Alpha King. Instead, she saw something else. Regret. He turned to leave, his hand on the door. "I will give you a choice, Storm. Stay as my prisoner or become my Luna. The decision is yours." Her breath hitched, her fists clenching as she whispered, "I would rather suffer." Troy's shoulders tensed, but he walked away, leaving her alone with the storm raging inside her. A while later, the door creaked open again, and a group of maids entered, their arms full with linens and towels. Without a word, they moved to draw her a warm bath in the large tub positioned in the king's suite. Steam curled into the air, and the scent of lavender and vanilla filled the room, a stark contrast to the filth and blood she had been covered in for days. After her bath, one of the maids approached hesitantly, holding out a gown of soft silk. "The Alpha has provided this for you, my lady." Storm glanced at the beautiful fabric, its embroidery intricate, clearly meant for someone of high status. Her jaw tightened. She wanted nothing from him. "No," she said firmly, surprising the maids. "Just give me a plain linen dress, like yours." The maids exchanged startled glances, but obeyed, quickly retrieving a simple garment. Storm took it without a word, her mind set. She would not wear something that bore the mark of his claim, no matter how soft or luxurious it was. She was not his prize. As they lingered, hesitant to leave, Storm let out an annoyed sigh. "I can dress myself. Leave me alone," she muttered, not unkindly, but with enough irritation to make them hurry out. The door closed behind them, and she finally let herself breathe, the weight of the situation settling on her once more. The days that followed were a blur of torture and defiance. She refused his offers, his attempts at kindness, even when her body screamed for relief. Being locked in his suite made everything worse. His scent lingered in every corner, wrapping around her like a relentless reminder of the bond she had spent years trying to escape. The very air felt thick with him, making it difficult to breathe, to think clearly. Each moment spent in his space was a cruel game of endurance, one she was determined not to lose. She would not let him win. After some time, Troy granted her permission to wander within the Packlands, but with a warning. If she attempted to run again, she would be punished. It was a twisted sort of freedom, but she took it, using every opportunity to gain his trust. She played along, pretending to be subdued, waiting for the right moment. One evening, she seized that moment, Under the cover of dusk, she ran, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pushed her exhausted body to its limits. She had made it beyond the village, past the sentries, almost to the thick forest that bordered the territory when a blur of movement cut her off. A growl vibrated through the air, raw and furious. Troy. Before she could react, he had her pinned against a tree, his golden eyes blazing with fury, dominance, and something even more dangerous. Possession. His grip was unyielding, his breath hot and ragged against her skin as she thrashed against him. Her pulse pounded wildly, a desperate rhythm of resistance and something deeper, something she refused to acknowledge. She pushed against his chest, but he didn't budge, his strength an immovable force against her trembling defiance. The mate bond crackled between them, suffocating, relentless, stirring emotions she had buried long ago. Fear, anger, and an unbidden longing tangled inside her, making it impossible to think. She gritted her teeth, fighting to ignore the heat radiating from his body, the way his presence seemed to swallow her whole. "Let me go," she growled. But even to her own ears, the demand lacked the force she intended. Storm struggled against his grip, her breath coming in ragged gasps as adrenaline surged through her veins. She twisted her body, pushing against his chest, but he didn't budge. His strength was overwhelming, his presence suffocating. Her heart pounded violently as she fought the primal pull of the mate bond, the undeniable connection that sent heat coursing through her despite her hatred. "Let me go," she hissed, her voice laced with both fear and defiance. Troy's fingers tightened around her wrists, his jaw clenching as if waging his own internal battle. "You think I would let you slip through my fingers again?" His breath was hot against her skin, his proximity intoxicating. "You belong to me, Storm. You always have." She gritted her teeth, her pulse roaring in her ears as she thrashed, desperate to escape his hold. But no matter how hard she fought, the bond held her just as much as his iron grip. Her body betrayed her, a traitorous shiver running down her spine. Panic warred with something deeper, something she refused to acknowledge. She had survived too much to fall into his grasp again. "Never," she spat, her voice shaking. But even as she said it, the part of her that longed for freedom trembled under the weight of his unwavering claim. "Did you really think you could escape me?" His voice was low, lethal, his breath hot against her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling as she glared at him defiantly. "I will never belong to you." Troy's jaw clenched, his grip tightening just enough to remind her of his power. "Then I will make sure you never run again." Without another word, he lifted her into his arms and carried her back to the castle, straight into his chambers, locking the door behind them. He placed her on the bed and the mate bond surged between them, an invisible force tearing at her defenses. It was worse than any physical torment she had endured, an unbearable pull that made her body ache for him against her will. The heat of his presence, the intensity of his gaze. It was suffocating. She fought it, biting her lip to stop the shivers coursing through her, but her body betrayed her. Trembling under the weight of emotions she didn't want to feel. "Let me go," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, her resolve beginning to crack. For a moment, Troy just stared at her, his own breath uneven. And then, to her utter shock, he released her. He stepped away, his golden eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite decipher, and without another word, he left the room, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. Storm sat there, her heart racing, her mind spinning. He could have done anything to her. He had every opportunity, every ounce of power to break her completely, but he didn't. Did this mean he had really changed? Or was this just another game? But as time passed, the walls around her resolve began to crack. The kingdom had changed, transformed into something almost unrecognizable from the past she had fled. War had not just reshaped it, but had seemingly refined it. The streets were cleaner, The once rugged paths now lined with well-maintained cobblestone. Lush parks and expansive gardens had been cultivated, bursting with vibrant flora that softened the edges of the hardened kingdom. Schools had been established, their walls echoing with the laughter of young pups, while hospitals had been built, offering care to those in need. The pack was thriving, its people no longer merely surviving but flourishing under Troy's rule. He was still ruthless, still powerful, but there was something new beneath his exterior, a depth she had never seen before. A ruler who had not only conquered but nurtured. One night as she lay awake in her chambers, the door creaked open, and Troy entered without a word. He carried himself differently, not with the overbearing dominance she had come to expect, but with something quieter, something more restrained. He sat across from her, his golden eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite decipher. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice low. "About many things." Storm tensed, swallowing hard. "And what do you want from me now?" His gaze flickered with something unreadable before he spoke. "I want you to see the truth, not just about me, but about us." She searched his face, looking for the cold indifference she had known in him before. Instead, she found something else. Wounds left by time and war. Regrets that haunted him as much as her past haunted her. He was still dangerous, still powerful, but different. And that realization terrified her, because deep down, despite everything, the bond between them still pulsed like a slow-burning fire. And if she wasn't careful, it would consume her. Days passed, and despite her every attempt to fight it, Storm found herself watching Troy more closely, searching for cracks in the armor he once wore so proudly. She saw him not only as a ruthless king, but as a leader who had suffered, who had bled for his people, who had changed in ways she never thought possible. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the grand castle, Troy found her sitting in the garden, her fingers trailing through the delicate petals of the newly planted roses. She turned at his approach, her heart stammering in her chest. For once there was no tension, no battle of wills, just an unspoken understanding hovering between them. "I should hate you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had endured. "I know," he murmured, stepping closer, his golden eyes never leaving hers. "And yet here we are." The air between them crackled thick with tension, as if the very universe held its breath, waiting for one of them to make a move. A deep, aching heat coiled in Storm's chest, battling the wariness that had shielded her heart for so long. Troy's gaze darkened, his lips parting slightly, as though he too felt the unbearable weight of the moment pressing in around them. Every nerve in her body was on high alert, her skin tingling with the awareness of his proximity, the sheer force of his presence pulling her toward him like an unseen gravity. The space between them felt fragile, electric, as if one breath, one step closer, would shatter every barrier she had so carefully built. A slow, heated tension coiled between them, thick and electric, making every breath feel heavier. Troy's eyes darkened as he studied her, his fingers twitching slightly as if fighting the instinct to reach for her. Storm swallowed hard, her own body betraying her as warmth spread through her chest, a deep ache settling low in her stomach. She felt the rise and fall of her own breath, shallow and uneven, as the space between them seemed to shrink. The heat of his body reached her first, a subtle yet intoxicating pull that left her feeling unsteady. Every fiber of her being told her to step back, to resist, but she remained rooted in place, unable to deny the undeniable any longer. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, almost reverent, as if afraid she might disappear. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, really looked, and for the first time, she saw not just the Alpha King, but the man beneath. And maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of a second chance, just as she had fought so hard for hers. Troy exhaled slowly, his fingers tilting her chin upward. Storm, I have made many mistakes. But if I have to spend the rest of my life proving myself to you, I will. She searched his eyes, looking for deception, but found none. The man before her was not the ruthless king who had cast her aside, nor was he the war-hardened ruler she had once feared. He was raw, exposed, and something in his golden gaze held an unspoken plea. Did she believe him? Could she? A part of her wanted to scoff, to remind him of the pain she had endured. But another part, a quieter, more dangerous part, ached at the sincerity in his voice. She had spent so long running, so long guarding her heart, but now, standing before him, she felt something shift. Doubt, hope, fear, they all tangled together in a confusing web, making it impossible to distinguish one from the other. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. What if I never forgive you? Troy's grip on her chin softened, his thumb brushing over her skin, as if memorizing the feel of her. Then I will wait. However long it takes, I will wait. But I will never stop trying. Storm's heart clenched, torn between the past that had scarred her and the uncertain promise of what lay ahead. And for the first time, she didn't know which one she feared more. A part of her still wanted to resist, but the mate bond, the thing she had fought against so fiercely, pulled her forward. She closed her eyes as he leaned in, their breaths mingling, their hearts pounding in unison. And then finally his lips brushed against hers, soft at first, tentative, like a whisper of a confession neither of them had dared to voice. A shiver ran through her as warmth pooled deep in her stomach, her breath hitching when his fingers traced a slow, reverent path along her jaw. The tension that had bound them for so long unraveled in that single moment. The electricity between them. Undeniable. She melted into the kiss, her fingers curling into the fabric of his tunic, feeling the solid strength beneath. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only him, only this moment, only the quiet surrender she could no longer fight. A shiver ran through her, anticipation mixing with the heat pooling deep within her. Her breath hitched as his fingers traced a slow, reverent path along her jaw, his touch igniting sparks across her skin. The world around them faded. The only thing that existed was the intoxicating warmth of his lips pressing more firmly against hers. She clung to his tunic, feeling the taut muscles beneath as his other hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her closer. Her heart thundered in her chest, each pulse a symphony of emotions she could no longer suppress. It was more than a kiss, it was a surrender, a collision of past pain and present longing, a promise that neither of them would ever be the same again. But as the moment deepened, so did the kiss, slow, unhurried, yet charged with an undeniable need. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw, sending shivers down her spine. The heat of him, the strength of his embrace, ignited something inside her that had long been buried. She melted into him, her fingers curling into his tunic, as the mate bond surged between them. No longer just a pull, but a tether anchoring them together. It was not just a kiss, it was a surrender, a claim, a beginning of something neither of them could deny any longer. For the first time in years, Storm allowed herself to believe that maybe fate had not been so cruel after all.